Hello, everybody. Let's go ahead and get started. We are getting even closer to the end of Unit 2, so we've got next week, and then that's it, actually. So today and next week, and then Unit 2 will be over. We will have a week break in between Unit 2 and Unit 3, and there will probably be some study sessions during that gap week for people who need to get some help completing up the last couple assignments. You might have noticed that the last couple classes, including today, the prep work's kind of been slowing down a little bit. We're not introducing as much new stuff lately, and that's intentional. We want to make sure you've got time to get these last few assignments finished up and submitted. So that should be your primary focus at this point in time. Please keep up with the prep work, of course, but getting those assignments in is top priority at this moment, and we want to help you out with that. So let me know, or let your TAs know what we can do to make that happen, to get you across the finish line for Unit 2 and on to Unit 3. Today, I've got some review questions for you that we can chat about real quick, mostly having to do with this ModelViewController paradigm that was introduced to you in today's prep work. And so let's review MVC real quick, and then we can talk about our flick list application a little bit as well. So MVC stands for ModelViewController. Those are the three components involved with the paradigm. And so what is the job of the model under this scheme? What is the model doing for us in this situation? Managing the data, yeah, so managing the information, that's right, yep. The view then is doing which part of the work? That one's maybe a little more self-explanatory, yeah. Go ahead.
I feel like in regards to a lot of projects,
No, you're right. So the views are the templates, but in a more general sense, the view is doing which piece for us? The display, yeah. What do our users see? That's a good way of putting it, yep. So the view is how that information is displayed to the user. And then what's the controller do? I'm sorry? What's the job of the controller? Like a middleman. Yeah, it kind of sits in between the model and the view to some degree, sure. It does a little bit more than that. Yeah, way in the back. Yeah, it handles when the user interacts with our application, right? The controller will receive that input, that feedback, and then decide what to do with it. That's the role of the controller. And so this is a very common framework. It's not the only one, actually. So ModelViewController is probably the first programming paradigm that a lot of people learn for creating apps, and it's been around for a while. It's still around today, and it's probably not going anywhere anytime soon. However, it has evolved over time. So you might see further iterations of ModelViewController out in the wild these days. Things like ModelViewModel are popular these days, especially with phone development, which kind of changed how we view apps compared to the pre-smartphone era. But MVC is still a very powerful and very commonly used paradigm. So in terms of our flick list application, we actually already talked about which piece comprises the view. That's going to be the templates, the HTML, which makes sense because that's what tells us how the data is going to be laid out, right? And you could lump CSS in that category as well. What about the model? What's the model in our setup? I'm sorry? The database. So the database is where the information gets stored. We also have a little bit outside the database too, right? The classes that we created, the objects that we created. And so those are what are actually interacting with the database, right? We label the fields of those classes, we use the ORM to associate those classes with tables in our database, so that we can easily take things from our database and turn them into Python objects, and vice versa, right? Take Python objects and insert them into the database. And then the controller is what? What's left, I guess? Yeah. The route handlers, yeah, you nailed it. So all of the handlers that we have, anything that starts with app.route on top of it, that's a controller. That's deciding what to do based on what our user is, how our user is navigating and interacting with our application. So what do the handlers do? They do things like form processing, right? Decide where to go next based on the information that you have inside of a form. That's a classic way of classic functionality for a controller to do. And so you can identify these pieces in many, many, many different apps. And I think, you know, introducing this concept, we've been using it the whole time, right? Like we started with controllers, and then we introduced views after that, templates, and then most recently we introduced the database and the models. Now that you have an idea of this framework, now that you're introduced to these concepts, think about it the next time you go visit other websites, right? You'll start to see these pieces pop out at you as you start visiting other websites and interacting with other applications as well. It kind of changes the way that you view the world after you are more familiar with this programming paradigm. And so the last question is maybe more of a philosophical or a high-level question, right? But why? Why is everybody hopping on the MVC bandwagon? What's the big deal? Why is it so popular? What's the big selling point of doing things this way? You don't have to repeat yourself as much, hopefully. I mean, that's always a goal for us as programmers, is being able to write code that we can reuse when necessary, not have to keep repeating ourselves over and over and over again. What else? There are some really good reasons why this is so popular and so widely used. Yeah?
Super simplified general perspective, it provides like the coding structure, like in the same way when we write an essay on a paragraph.
Sure. I like that comparison to, you know, something that maybe people are more familiar with, writing an essay, writing a paper, right? You know, paper usually starts out with making your claim, right? And then you spend a section providing proof for that claim and then wrapping it up with a conclusion. Well, you can think of MVC as a similar way to structure an application. And that's true. It follows a nice template, or it provides a nice template for people to follow. If you understand MVC and how those pieces interact with each other, right? Then the next time you want to build an app, you can look at all the pieces of that app and put them into those categories and decide where they need to go, right? So it does make the development process, the design process, a bit easier. There's one more really big, I think, very important reason why MVC is a powerful tool. Kind of overarches all of the answers that I've heard so far. Yeah.
Not really sure if this is the answer you're looking for, but I feel like it kind of really clearly paints this sort of control flow and how those three pieces interact.
Yeah, I think you're kind of getting to what I was thinking about. Yeah. So that's a big one. It's not language specific, right? That's what we mean by a paradigm. A paradigm is something that's not language specific. It's just a general design principle or a general design concept. So that's very powerful, right? We can use this in other contexts. In fact, guess what? Unit 3, we're going to be learning Java, and we're still going to be doing this. We're still going to be making MVC applications, right? That's not going to stop us, even though we're in a totally different language. It's going to look a little different, but it's still going to be a ModelViewController app. And really, I think the biggest selling point is kind of what Alex was getting to is you've got 3 distinct categories now, and that separation is very important. There's a very important concept called separation of concerns. I'm going to divide my app into the components, and those components are going to be focused on their thing, right? I've got a whole component of my app dedicated to managing data as it goes into and out of the database. I've got a whole component of my app that's dedicated to presenting the data to the user, right, in a meaningful way so that they understand what is going on. And clearly defining those terms, right? Clearly separating those pieces of functionality out and keeping them as separate from the other ones as much as possible. There's going to be some interaction, right? They have to communicate with each other, but we're keeping them separate as much as possible. Makes the design process, makes the development process, the process of working on applications like this, a lot easier. Because as a program developer, so the app that we're building, FlickList, we're building it together as a group, but in practice, what's going to happen? I'm going to have a whole team of people working on the same application. And you're not going to be in charge of all the pieces from top to bottom. You're going to be working on the model part or the controller part, right? And I can have multiple people working on those sections, and they kind of have to know what's going on with the other parts, but they can, for a large degree of it, just focus on that particular section. That's a very important and very necessary thing if we're talking about developing large-scale applications, the ability to keep those things separated. And that concept of separation of concerns is not is going to show up again and again and again as you get deeper and deeper into application development. Being able to clearly define the concerns and which part of the application is responsible for handling those concerns is a very, very important part of designing an efficient and effective application. So that ends my sales pitch for MVC. Hopefully you bought it, but if you didn't, well, too bad, because we're asking you to do it anyway for the last couple of assignments, right? I think that's actually all the review that I had today. There was not a giant amount of prep work. Are there any questions about MVC stuff before we switch gears and talk about FlickList a little bit to wrap up? Any questions? So we don't have a walkthrough today, but we do have a studio. We are asking you to work on FlickList a little bit. There is a studio on Canvas. I would say, though, I remind you that we're getting close to the end of Unit 2. So if you are especially if you feel as though you are behind on getting those assignments in, you should probably be working on those assignments at this point, I would say. If you're caught up or mostly caught up on those assignments, you feel like you're on track to finish on time, then take a look at that studio. It's going to actually ask you to complete the process that we started last week of creating separate lists of movies for each individual user, because if you recall where we ended last week, we actually just had one list of movies that was shared by all users. So that's not a very effective way of managing movies in our app. So today's studio is going to ask you to actually complete that process of giving each user their own separate list of movies, which is going to involve working with the models a bit, but also the controllers as well a little bit. So you'll dip into those pieces of the app. Yeah, if you've got all that stuff finished, I know some people have already started in on Unit 3 stuff. That's fine. That's certainly good if you are looking for things to do, or you might see if any of your fellow classmates need a little bit of help getting wrapped up with their assignments as well. But either way, please let us know what you need. Please keep us informed about where you're at. We want to help you. We want to get as many people across the finish line for Unit 2 as possible. But we can't do that if you don't talk to us. So let us know how you're doing. Let us know what you need help with. And we will chat about the studio at the end of class today. Thanks.
I managed to get 8